Okay, today's question. What is the appropriate size of government? What size of government is best for a given country? And maybe I should say a given country at a given time, a given stage of its development. This is a question the United States has dealt with historically, starting with the creation of the United States out of 13 colonies, so the 13 states that gained their independence from Britain during the 1770s and 1780s. They started as one size, a small country, if you add them all together, clinging to the Atlantic coast of North America, but they expanded. They expanded until they spanned the entire continent, all the way to the Pacific. So in American thinking, in American policy, in American actions, bigger was better. Now, bigger is better has often been the model, has been the rule of thumb of expanding countries, of empires. If you look at the British Empire, Britain is a small island nation, a small island, in fact, if you include Northern Ireland, Island Plus, and it became this worldwide empire. And it did so because British leaders thought there were advantages in being bigger. And one of the advantages, and go back to the days of the Roman Empire, the empires that preceded the Roman Empire, empire builders believe that bigger is better. Sometimes bigger is better because by conquering, by imposing your will on unruly neighbors, you increase the security of the original country. Sometimes you open new markets, so manufacturers and merchants in your country can find outlets. This was one of the driving forces of the British Empire. The British were derided by Napoleon as a nation of shopkeepers, but these shopkeepers built the largest empire in the world. Sometimes empires expand to gain new sources of supply, not just markets, but supply. The Japanese empire in the first half of the 20th century expanded because Japan is relatively short of natural resources that are needed to build an industrial economy. In fact, it was Japan's desire to expand even further into the Dutch East Indies to acquire the natural resources there that prompted the Japanese government to attack the United States because they thought that the United States would try to prevent Japan's expansion. The United States had said it would. That led to World War II in the Pacific. So expansion has been a common rule of thumb, but expansion is not the only way that nations, that governments, that political units can change size. Sometimes they can downsize. So in American history, even as the United States was expanding during the 19th century, there were influences, there were forces set at motion that argued in favor of smaller, that said that smaller was better. And in fact, the American Civil War grew out of a desire of Southerners to have a smaller country of their own. The advantage of a smaller country is that you don't have to worry about the opinions of those other people in the other parts of the country. And that's exactly what the states that joined the Confederacy wanted. They didn't want the opinions of Northerners, of anti-slavery Republicans, to tell them what to do about slavery. They wanted their own country. Now, interestingly enough, when the South seceded, Southerners immediately started thinking about expansion of their own. Could they expand into Mexico, perhaps? Could they expand into the Caribbean, maybe annex Cuba? So this business of is bigger better, is smaller better, it's an ongoing question. It's part of a question that I may have mentioned to you in an earlier lecture, but it's a fundamental challenge, a fundamental problem that every society has to deal with, and that is how best to organize a relationship between individuals and the larger community, and the group, individuals and the group. And there are two basic themes, two basic principles, or one could call them even mottos, that go with the two ends of the spectrum. One, the extreme individualist one, posits it's every man for himself. This was the traditional version of it. Today we would say every man or woman for himself or herself. You get the idea. Everybody for himself. The other one is we're all in this together. And at various times, the individualistic approach seems better. And in certain countries, in certain cultures, there's more emphasis on the individual and less on the collective. But even within the individualistic countries, and the United States comes in at the individualistic end of this spectrum compared to many other countries. For example, China. In China, there has been much more of a tolerance, much more of a willingness to look at the good of the collective. And people have argued that this is why the United States is a democracy, because democracy is based on individual rights and equality of individuals, and China has never been a democracy and has been one form or other of an authoritarian kind of system. And of late, since 1949, a system governed by the one-party rule by the Communist Party. So anyway, so the individualists would say, generally say, smaller is better. The collectivists might very well say that bigger is better. But as I say, it's an issue that every country, every society, every culture has to deal with. I've talked repeatedly in this course about nationalism. And nationalism has been this drive for this drive for nations, that is, nations conceived of as peoples, to have a government of their own. So to resolve this question, is bigger better or smaller better, to be bigger if it means uniting a bunch of the same people into a single country. This happened during the 19th century when Germany came together. So there were a bunch of German-speaking independent political units through most of the 19th century. But in the early 1870s, nearly all came together into the German Empire. And in fact, when Hitler and the Nazis annexed Austria, during the period of the Third Reich, the Third Empire, it was to continue this unification of German-speaking peoples, because the Austrians speak German. And when Italy got together in the 19th century, and so there had been a bunch of countries, independent political units in what is now Italy, but Italian unification, Italian nationalism in the 19th century took the form of adding them up, putting them together. You could call this sort of additive nationalism. But during the same time period as Italy and Germany were coming together, the American South was trying to pull the South away from the rest of the country. And they often spoke, Southerners often spoke of, we are a different people. We become so different than those Northerners that we have to have our own country. So that version is subtractive nationalism. And the nationalism of the 20th century was subtractive in the sense that many of the nationalist movements wanted to bail out of big colonial empires. So the British Empire was dissolved, the French Empire was dissolved, and it was dissolved into these smaller units where the people of India got their own country. Well, but even that sort of separated in two, because the Muslims in India, or many of the Muslims in India, wanted a country of their own separate from the country of the Hindu majority, and that's where Pakistan came from. Anyway, so this question of what's the optimal size, what's the appropriate size for government, is one that is with us all the time. And it has emerged in world affairs as they relate to the United States, particularly acutely in respect of two countries, or actually two parts of the world. Well, actually, in terms of sort of Europe, generally conceived. First, I'll talk about Russia. So Russia, before 1991, more precisely, Russia post-1917 and pre-1991 had been the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was organized in the wake of the Russian Revolution of 1917. And the Soviet Union was formerly the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So this was more than traditional Russia. In the thinking of Soviet leaders, Lenin especially, than Stalin, it was better for Russia to add more territory. And again, some of this was to add resources, to bulk up, so that Russia might be able better to defend itself against attacks from, say, Germany, which had happened just before the Russian Revolution and would happen again in World War II, and also to create sort of buffer states. And indeed, the Soviet Union bulked up even more after World War II by adding what was sometimes called the outer Soviet Empire, the countries of Eastern Europe that were under Soviet sway and often occupied by the Soviet Red Army forces. So the Soviet Union was making bigger better, but by the end of the Cold War, at the end of the Cold War, marking the end of the Cold War, the Soviet Union dissolved. It dissolved into its separate pieces. And this reflected the thinking, the feeling, that, well, at least at that particular point in time, smaller was better. So the different republics, the SSRs, the Soviet Socialist republics that made up the USSR, they wanted out. They didn't want to be part of Russia, and Russia, people in Russia didn't want to be part of the Soviet Union anymore. They wanted their own country. So by the 1990s, in the former Soviet Union, the trend was in the direction of smaller is better, more pieces is better. What's the advantage there? Well, each of the separate pieces can be more responsive to the desires of the people who live there. So people who lived in Ukraine didn't have identical interests to people who lived in Russia. And people who lived in Kazakhstan didn't have identical interest to people who lived in Moldova. And so it made a lot of sense. It was during this time as well, I talked about this earlier, that Yugoslavia was breaking up into its separate pieces. And the desire in all these cases was to find a government that is more reflective of the interests of the people who live there. So it's a form of nationalism. Again, I'll call it subtractive nationalism because they'd been part of this larger multinational group, and now they're breaking into smaller pieces. Now, one of the disadvantages that became painfully apparent in Yugoslavia was that, well, sometimes these groups that now have their separate countries or claim they're separate countries will go to war with each other. And one of the arguments in favor of empires was, if you can put a greater authority over everybody, then these different nationalities are less likely to go to war with each other. So with both bigger and smaller, there are trade-offs. There are advantages and disadvantages. And sometimes it seems that people just want to change because whatever system they have isn't perfect, and they think, well, okay, the other system will be better. And sometimes the decisions are made emotionally as much as they are made rationally. Sometimes they are made out of self-interest as much as perceived interests or expressed interests of the larger group. So one of the things that sometimes drives the leadership of these nationalist movements is the simple fact that there are people who want to have power. And if you are kind of stuck within this larger entity, and for one reason or other you know you'll never rise to the top, well, if you break it up, then maybe you can rise to the top of that. And one can see some of this in America's own revolution. America broke away from the British Empire. Americans thought, okay, the empire is too big. The empire is not adequately representing the interests of the American people. And if you look at particular individuals, start with George Washington. George Washington was a talented military leader, but he couldn't get the recognition that he wanted, that he desired, that he thought he deserved in the British Army, because the British Army had this prejudice against colonials, people who weren't in Britain, and people who, well, the way the British Army was organized in those days, who couldn't buy their new rank. And Washington got frustrated at this. And this wasn't the only thing by any means. There were lots of other reasons. But Washington could envision that should Virginia become independent of Great Britain, then he could become a leader of Virginia. And in fact, more than that, Washington became the commanding general of America's Continental Army, so the #1 soldier in the United States, and then he became president of the United States. He became the #1 civilian leader of the United States. He never would have gained that kind of recognition had the United States remained part of the British Empire. George Washington was never going to be called the father of the British Empire, but he was called the father of his country in the United States. So anyway, lots of ambitions, lots of reasons that go into this stuff. Looking at Russia. So Russia is the heir of the Soviet Union. It inherits the Soviet seat among the permanent members of the Security Council. This is a big deal. It inherits the Soviet Union's nuclear weapons. So Russia is still a great power in form. It's less a great power than it was because it doesn't now have the automatic support of the other members of the former Soviet Union. And also Russia is caught trying to figure out what its future is going to be. I was talking about the connection between capitalism or economic development and democracy as it related, as it was opposed of China, well, Russia was going through the same sort of thing. So in the post-Soviet world, there are a lot of people in Russia who thought this ought to be a post-communist world as well. And Russia went through a rapid privatization of a lot of formerly public assets. A communist system has a socialist economy. In a socialist economy, the state owns the major means of production. Well, the state went largely out of business after the demise of the Soviet Union, and all those state enterprises were sold off. And so Russia went sort of pell-mell toward capitalism. It didn't do it very neatly, it didn't do it very fairly, and the result was a group of people, the so-called oligarchs, the ones who wound up with the productive resources and the money, and were sort of lording it over the rest of Russia. Russia for a while was looking like it was going to become democratic as it became capitalist, but Russia had no long tradition of democracy. And this gets at something I was saying in the last lecture. So how does democracy come about? Is it connected to economic growth? A deeper way of looking at the question, does democracy simply have to evolve over time and over a long period of time? In the United States, democracy emerged in the mid-19th century, but it emerged out of centuries of struggle, steps in that direction in English history and then British history. So it didn't come out of nowhere. In Russia, democracy, if it came in the 1990s, was going to have to come pretty much out of nowhere because Russia had no tradition of democracy. Well, it made certain halting steps, and then the steps were kind of halted after Vladimir Putin took charge of Russia. And this was just at the end of the 20th century. And Putin was somebody, he had been a member of the KGB, the Soviet Security Service. And he looked back on the days of the Soviet Union fondly. He looked back on a time when the Soviet Union was this great power that the world had to pay attention to, that the United States had to pay attention to. And his career was just coming to a point where now you're really going to get going, and then the Soviet Union dissolves. And he's left, and as all sorts of other people in a similar situation are left, okay, what do we do now? And some of them went into sort of private industry, some of them became the oligarchs. A lot of them were just kind of left trying to figure out what in the world do we do. Putin found his way into government, into civilian government, and he found his way to the top of civilian government. And he made a determination that Russia, the appropriate heir to the Soviet Union, needed to regain some of the power, some of the reputation that it had lost. And he was going to do this by, first of all, increasing the power of the central government. So as I say, in Russia, there was no tradition of democracy. Russia had always had some form of autocracy, monarchy for centuries, and then the Communist Party. And Putin gravitated in the direction of one-party rule. And he managed to do this by a variety of political means. He was adept politically, and sometimes he formally held the top position, sometimes he put somebody else in charge, but he pulled the strings from behind. So he was going to restore the power of the Russian government, and he also talked about restoring the influence of Russia in foreign affairs. And one of the ways he decided to do this was to take on the United States, because it was his thinking and the thinking of very many people in Russia of his same age and position in professional life, that the Soviet Union had just stumbled and kowtowed to the United States. It was disgraceful that the Soviet Union had essentially surrendered the Cold War to the United States. And so Putin cast himself as the leader of the Russians against Russia's foreign foes, starting often with the United States. Now, this business of leaders of countries finding enemies abroad to gain support at home, this goes way back, and you see it in all sorts of countries. You see it sometimes by design, even in democracy, sometimes sort of inadvertently. In 2001, just before the terrorist attacks of 9/11, George W. Bush's approval rating among American voters was pretty low. It was in keeping with the low approval ratings that government had had since Vietnam and Watergate. And people who had confidence in government, the people just didn't have confidence in government before 9/11. Comes 9/11, all of a sudden the United States has this foreign enemy, a rather vague foreign enemy, the terrorists, whoever they might be, Osama bin Laden and other terrorists. But still, Americans looked to the central government. And so when there is a foreign crisis, governments at home tend to do better. So Putin whipped up animus against the United States, against other foreigners, for his own domestic political purposes. So sometimes he did that. Sometimes he did it for Russia's strategic purposes. Vladimir Putin eventually annexed Crimea. Crimea is a peninsula that after the breakup of the Soviet Union was part of the new Republic of Ukraine. But historically, Russia had had a large influence in Crimea, and many of the people who lived in Crimea were Russian nationalists, were Russian speakers. And Putin just said that this is historically part of Russia and we're going to take it. And he did. He sent in troops, sometimes in camouflage uniforms, and said this is going to be part of Russia. We're going to annex Russia. We're going to annex Crimea on behalf to Russia. And the world, led by the United States, disapproved. The United States said, no, this is something that shouldn't happen. But unlike what George H.W. Bush, the elder Bush, had said in response to the Iraqi invasion and occupation of Kuwait, and Iraq, Saddam Hussein said, we're going to annex Kuwait, the United States did not send in troops to liberate Crimea. Now, Putin knew this wasn't going to happen because Crimea was right in the backyard of Russia and a long way from the United States. It would have been very difficult for the United States to do anything militarily about this. But also, at this particular time, Americans were showing a weariness with, well, what the elder George Bush had called the New World Order. And Americans just were in no mood to go to war, to reattach Crimea to Ukraine, and just more or less let it go. Refused to acknowledge it, and to this day the United States does not acknowledge that Russia controls Crimea legitimately, and the United States government imposed economic sanctions on individuals of the Russian government and the Russian government, but the United States took no stronger action than that, and it looks like it's going to stick. So this question of Russia, is Russia emerging again as a great power, as a challenger to the United States? Putin would like that to be the case, and he's stirring up trouble for the United States. He reflexively takes the opposite position of the United States in various places around the world. When a civil war broke out in Syria, starting in 2011, the Russian government sided with the government of Bashar al-Assad, the Syrian government, and the United States sided with, although not with direct military force, with the rebels. And so Putin was essentially recreating the confrontation that had existed during the Cold War. Did Putin want a new Cold War? Well, to some degree, because during the Cold War, as he remembered, the Soviet Union had been this great power that the United States and the world had had to pay attention to. Russia in the 1990s and the early 2000s was not seen in that light at all. But maybe the world would see Russia in that way again. So this is, and remains a challenge to American foreign policy. What does the United States do about Russia? What should the American position on Russia be? To take another arena of the appropriate size of government, very briefly, the European Common Market was created in the 1950s to prevent the kind of competition that had given rise to World War I and World War II. The United States sponsored the European Common Market, which became the European Community, which became the European Union. And the United States generally thought this was a good idea. The countries of Europe, if they can get together, if they can become allied with each other, if they can become good business partners of each other, then they're less likely to go to war. The United States remembered American troops got drawn into World War I, which was a war among the Europeans, and World War II, which was also a war among the Europeans in particular. If France and Germany can be kept from each other's throats, then all to the better. The United States was very glad for the existence of the European community becoming the European Union when Germany became reunified with the support of American President George Bush in 1990, because the thinking was that Germany once again is going to be powerful, and that could be trouble for its neighboring countries unless Germany was tied into this larger European Union. So West Germany had been tied into NATO. The unified Germany was still tied into NATO, but economically it was tied into this European Union. And so it was the hope of American leaders, it was the belief of American leaders, that the U.S. doesn't have to worry about a revived and ambitious Germany, because Germany is part of this larger unit, the European Union. But the European Union had problems of its own, coming from the fact that, well, what is the appropriate size of government, in this case, in Europe? So the thinking was that in the first half of the 20th century, as demonstrated by 2 world wars, the governments of Europe were too small. So there were these competing nations that went to war with each other. So we need a bigger government to keep them from going to war with each other. And thus was created what eventually became the European Union. But there were plenty of times when the European Union seemed too big. And various groups within the European Union decided, wait a minute, this really isn't serving our interests very well. Financial crisis hit the world in 2008. It hit the United States, hit the European Union, hit East Asia, hit everybody. And in this financial crisis, some big strains developed in the European economy, more precisely in the Eurozone, the part of the European Union that includes all the countries that adopted the euro. Oh, I should add, so within the European Union, this Eurozone was created at the beginning of the 21st century. And the idea was, with a common currency, then these different countries are bound together, and especially their economies are bound together even more closely. And this is going to be good. It's going to be easy to travel, it's going to be easy to do business across borders, and things are going to be all better. But amid the financial crisis of 2008 and after, strains developed, because although there was financial, monetary union, there wasn't union of tax laws, there wasn't union of fiscal policies. And some countries like Germany were very responsible, always paid their debts on time. And other countries were less so. Greece found itself very deeply in debt, and it looked as though the Greeks might not be able to pay their debts, couldn't support the debt they'd put out. And it looked as though the euro was going to be under real strain. And either Germany would have to bail out Greece, or the Eurozone, maybe even the EU, the European Union, would fall to pieces. And for a while, it looked like that was indeed going to be the case. And people shuddered for the future of the European Union, because the thinking had been for the previous 40 or 50 years, bigger is better. Bigger government is more appropriate, is optimal for Europe. But then it looked like this bigger wasn't working and it was going to fall apart. Well, it didn't fall apart over the division between North and South and the debt crisis after 2008. But it did fall apart, or I guess I should say it is falling apart as of the summer of 2020, after a vote by the people of Britain to leave the European Union. So Brexit, as it's called, Britain's exit from the European Union, is underway. Officially, Britain exited the European Union at the beginning of 2020, but working out the terms of the departure is still an ongoing project. And what does it mean? Well, it signals that, at least for the people of Britain, the EU had gotten too big. The appropriate size of government, in the thinking of the majority, a small majority, but a majority of people who voted in favor of Brexit, is smaller than the European Union. The whole idea was to bring control of government away from the European Union, bring it back to Britain. And this had to do with various government policies, including policy over immigration, and it had to do with ideas that maybe British businesses would be better in a world market rather than a euro market, but a lot of it was emotional, and it was this idea that government has gotten too big. The bureaucrats in Brussels, the headquarters of the EU, aren't listening to us, and we need to bring government home. So this question of what's the appropriate size of government often has to do with matters of power, has to do with matters of economics, but it also has to do with matters of what are people just feeling at the moment. And this moment varies from moment to moment, period to period. It's sometimes in American history, in the history of Europe. Bigger seems to be better. At other times, smaller seems to be better. You know, the only conclusion, the general conclusion I can draw out of this is, I often say this, and I don't say it as in cynicism or despair, but humans are really hard to satisfy. And whatever is the status quo, there are going to be people who complain about the status quo. And if the status quo is big at the moment, then they want to make it smaller. If it's small at the moment, they want to make it bigger. And I suspect that this will probably always be the case in one form or another.